She leaned close, her voice barely a whisper, "You're distracted in class." I swallowed hard and answered before I could stop myself, "Because you're the lesson." From that moment, everything between us changed. The first time I walked into her classroom, I felt something shift inside me, though I couldn't put it into words then. It wasn't just about the subject she was teaching, it was the way she carried herself, the quiet authority in her tone, and the calm presence that seemed to settle the whole room. She was older, yes, but it was more than that. There was grace in the way she moved, patience in the way she explained even the smallest detail, and a kind of strength in her eyes that made me want to keep listening long after the lesson was over. Every student noticed she was beautiful, but my attention went deeper. I noticed how her glasses slid down her nose when she leaned over her desk, how she'd pushed them back up with a small, almost unconscious touch. I noticed the way sunlight through the tall windows caught the faint silver in her hair, strands that only made her look more dignified, more real. She was someone who had lived, someone who carried experience and stories in the small lines around her eyes. When she spoke, the whole class seemed to lean forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, like a calm stream cutting through silence. I caught myself watching her hands as she wrote on the board, her fingers steady and precise, chalk dust sometimes brushing against her sleeves. And when she turned to face us, her gaze often landed on me just long enough to make me feel as if she saw more than a student sitting at a desk. I tried to focus on the lessons, but I'd catch myself memorizing the little details instead, the click of her heels against the floor, the faint trace of her perfume when she passed between the rows of desks, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear with a small, practiced motion. These were things no one else seemed to notice, but for me, they became the true rhythm of the class. And maybe that's why I always seemed a little lost when she called on me to answer a question. My mind was full, but not with formulas or definitions. It was full of her. Full of the way she filled the room with something I couldn't explain, something warm, magnetic, impossible to ignore. At the time, I didn't know where this attention would lead. All I knew was that her presence stirred something inside me, something I had never felt before. She wasn't just my teacher. Somehow, she was becoming the lesson itself. It happened on a quiet afternoon, when the room felt heavier than usual. The sun had softened, streaming through the tall windows in golden stripes across the floor. The rest of the class was focused on their notes, pens scratching lightly, but my mind was elsewhere. My eyes kept wandering, following the way her hand glided across the page, tracing the shape of her words in chalk, drifting back to the calm curve of her smile when she caught someone's answer. I thought I was being careful, keeping my thoughts to myself. But she noticed. She always noticed. As she moved between the desks, her heels clicking softly against the tile, she stopped by mine. Her shadow fell across my notebook, pulling me back from my daydreams. And then, before anyone else could hear, she leaned down, close enough that I felt the warmth of her presence, close enough that her perfume curled around me like a secret. Her voice was a whisper, meant for me alone. "You're distracted in class." The words brushed against my ear like a touch. My pulse jumped, my throat tightened, and for a heartbeat I couldn't find any reply. But the silence between us felt too loaded, too alive, and the truth slipped out before I could stop it. "Because you're the lesson." The moment hung there, suspended, as if the air itself had stopped moving. My words were bold, too bold for the space we were in, but they were also honest. More honest than anything I had said in weeks. She froze, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite name, surprise, maybe, or something deeper she quickly tried to hide. A faint color rose in her cheeks, delicate yet unmistakable, and she pressed her lips together as though weighing her response. Then, with the smallest smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she straightened, her posture once again composed, professional. She moved on, addressing another student as though nothing had passed between us. But I had seen it. That moment, the warmth in her eyes, the softness in her breath, the way her control faltered just long enough to betray that she felt it too. From then on, the classroom was different. Every time she looked my way, I wondered if she remembered those words. Every time her voice softened, I thought of the whisper. She had meant it as a correction, but it became something else entirely, a spark neither of us could put out. After that day, the air in the classroom changed. It wasn't anything obvious, no one else would have noticed, but for me, every small moment carried weight, and for her, I could sense the careful pauses, the subtle hesitations she didn't mean to show. When she handed back graded papers, her fingers brushed mine for the briefest second. It could have been accidental, it should have been accidental, but it didn't feel that way. The touch was light, almost nothing, yet it lingered. Warmth spread across my skin, and I found myself staring at the page without reading a word on it. She moved on quickly, though I caught the way her lips pressed together, as if reminding herself to stay composed. Other times, it was in the way she avoided my gaze, not entirely, but just enough that it became noticeable. Her eyes would sweep across the class, steady and confident, but when they reached me, they flickered for the smallest instant before moving on. That hesitation said more than words could. It was as if she knew something had been set in motion between us, something delicate she wasn't sure she should acknowledge. I noticed everything. The faint silver strands in her hair that glimmered in the afternoon light. The graceful way she leaned across a desk to help a student, her voice soft but certain. The way her sleeve brushed against my arm when she leaned too close to point at a note in my notebook. Each detail etched itself into me like a secret I couldn't let go of. But the more I watched her, the more I realized something else, she was changing too. Her explanations carried the same clarity, her professionalism never wavered, yet in the quiet spaces, she seemed more guarded, more aware of the distance between us. And at the same time, more drawn into it. There were moments when our eyes met unexpectedly. She'd hold my gaze for a heartbeat too long, just long enough for a silent understanding to pass between us. Then she'd clear her throat, adjust her papers, and return to the lesson with practiced ease. But my heart would still be racing, carrying the weight of what had just been shared in that single glance. The classroom was no longer just a place for lessons. It had become something else, a stage where every glance, every brush of a hand, every pause in her voice felt like another step in a story neither of us had planned to write. And though nothing had been spoken, we both knew we were no longer just teacher and student. We were something unspoken, something fragile, and yet impossible to ignore. It happened one afternoon when most of the class had already left. I lingered, pretending to organize my notes, though the truth was I didn't want to walk away just yet. The room was quieter now, filled only with the faint hum of the overhead lights and the scrape of chairs being stacked in the corner. She looked up as she gathered her papers, her brow lifting in quiet curiosity. "Did you need help with something?" she asked. Her voice carried its usual calm, but there was a softness beneath it, almost as if she already knew my reason for staying behind. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I could frame my excuse convincingly. I was hoping you could go over today's material again. I feel like I'm missing something." She hesitated for a breath, then gestured toward the chair beside her desk. "All right. Let's take a look." Sitting so close to her was different from watching her at the front of the room. The space between us was narrow, the air warm with the faint trace of her perfume, the golden light from the tall windows spilling across her desk. I could see details I had never noticed before, the delicate shape of her hands as she adjusted the pages, the small lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of years of laughter and long nights. We started with the lesson, but it didn't stay on formulas and examples for long. The conversation slipped into other places, where she had studied, the challenges she faced in her early career, the books she loved but never had time to reread. She spoke with a rare openness, her voice gentler now, almost reflective. I listened, not just to the words, but to the woman behind them. And for the first time, she wasn't just my teacher. She was someone who carried her own history, her own weight, her own quiet dreams. When silence stretched between us, she folded her hands and smoothed the fabric of her skirt as if trying to ground herself. Her eyes flickered toward mine, hesitant, as though aware that the line between us was thinning with every moment. I wanted to reach across that distance, to bridge the space that suddenly felt like the most fragile thing in the world. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence speak, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between us. By the time I stood to leave, the classroom felt different, changed. She wasn't just the woman at the board anymore. She had allowed me to see her, even if only for a moment, and that glimpse had settled into me in a way I couldn't ignore. The evening rain began unexpectedly, drumming against the tall windows with a steady rhythm that hushed the usual noise of the halls outside. Most of the class had already gone, their laughter fading down the corridor, but I stayed, pretending to organize my things. She was still at her desk, shuffling through a stack of papers, unaware that I was watching her in that quiet, golden light. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and I could tell she was weighing whether to leave or wait it out. Finally, she let out a soft sigh, setting her pen aside. "Looks like we're stuck for a while," she said, glancing at me with a half-smile. I nodded, my heart quickening at the thought of being alone with her in this suspended moment, as if the storm itself had conspired to keep us there together. I pulled a chair closer to her desk, and she didn't object. The space between us was small, small enough that I could hear the faint catch of her breath when thunder rolled in the distance. For a while, we sat in silence, listening to the rain. Then, almost too quietly, she spoke. "What you said the other day, about being distracted because I'm the lesson. Do you remember?" Her voice trembled just enough to betray what it cost her to bring it up. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "I remember," I said, my voice low, steady, though inside everything was racing. She lowered her gaze, fingertips tracing the edge of a notebook as if she couldn't meet my eyes while admitting what came next. "It's been echoing in my head. More than it should." Lightning flickered across the window, illuminating the faint blush on her cheeks, the way her lips pressed together as though bracing for the weight of her own honesty. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe for a moment. The world had narrowed to just her voice, her words, her nearness. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch, filled with rain and thunder and all the unspoken truths between us. My hand rested on the desk, open, almost unconsciously so, and I noticed hers not far away. For a second, I thought she might close the distance herself. She didn't, not yet. But the way her eyes lifted to mine, shimmering with something caught between fear and desire, told me everything I needed to know. The lines between us were still intact, but they were thinner now. And for the first time, she wasn't pretending otherwise. The storm had passed by the next day, but inside me the weight of her words still lingered. I couldn't focus on anything else. The way her voice had trembled when she admitted she'd been carrying my sentence with her, the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes that she usually kept hidden so carefully. That evening, when I found myself again lingering after class, she didn't send me away. Instead, she sat at her desk with her papers set aside, as though she had been expecting me, or maybe as though she didn't have the strength to tell me no. For a while, neither of us spoke. The quiet stretched out, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Finally, she looked at me, her expression caught between resolve and hesitation. "This, whatever this is," she began softly, her voice low enough that it felt like a secret, "it shouldn't exist. You know that, don't you?" I nodded, though my chest ached with the truth of it. "I know." Her eyes softened, but her hand trembled slightly as she smoothed the edge of her sleeve. "There's an age between us, responsibilities I can't ignore. I can't afford to lose myself in something that isn't safe." The words were logical, rational, the kind of thing she had to say. But the way her voice faltered on safe, the way she avoided my gaze as though afraid of what I might see, told me there was more underneath. I didn't argue. Instead, I let silence settle again. My hand rested lightly on the desk, open, waiting, not pushing, not demanding, just there. And after a long pause, her hand shifted toward mine. Slowly, hesitantly, until her fingers brushed against my own. The touch was so slight it could have been nothing. But when she didn't pull away, when her hand finally settled against mine, trembling but present, it became everything. Her skin was warm, softer than I had imagined, her grip uncertain at first, then steadier as I curled my fingers gently around hers. The moment stretched, fragile and infinite, and in it, words weren't necessary. She was telling me everything in that touch, her fear, her longing, her quiet surrender. When she finally looked up, her eyes were shimmering, not with control or distance, but with a kind of raw honesty I had never seen in her before. In that silence, in that trembling hand held within mine, the confession neither of us had dared to speak was already complete. The days that followed felt different, though nothing had been spoken aloud. We didn't need to name what was happening between us, it lived in the small moments, in the glances we couldn't disguise, in the way her voice softened when she addressed me, as though she was afraid her tone alone might betray too much. Still, there was one moment when words finally found their way through the silence. It was late, the classroom empty except for the two of us. She stood by the window, gathering her things, while I sat at my desk pretending to finish a page of notes I'd written a dozen times already. The light outside had faded into the soft blue of evening, and for the first time all day, the world seemed still. When she turned to me, her eyes held the same quiet strength they always had, but there was something else too, a gentleness that felt like surrender. She walked toward me slowly, setting her books down on the desk with a careful motion, as if grounding herself before stepping into something fragile. Her hand lifted, hesitant at first, then sure, and she touched my cheek. The gesture was light, her thumb brushing against my skin with a tenderness that carried more weight than any embrace. I held still, not wanting to break the moment, letting her closeness wash over me like a truth we had both been resisting for too long. Her voice, when it came, was steady but soft, carrying all the emotion she had tried to hold back. "Some lessons," she whispered, "take time." It wasn't a promise of immediacy, nor was it a denial. It was something deeper, an acknowledgement that what had begun between us wasn't fleeting, that it wasn't just the pull of distraction or curiosity. It was real, and it deserved the patience and care she had always shown in every other part of her life. I covered her hand with mine, pressing it gently against my cheek, letting her feel the steadiness of my heartbeat beneath her touch. For once, I didn't try to speak. Words would have only diluted the purity of that moment. When she finally stepped back, she did so with a soft smile, her eyes lingering on mine longer than they ever had before. And though she walked away, leaving the classroom in silence, I knew something had changed forever. She was still my teacher, still the woman who stood at the front of the room with authority and grace. But now, she was also the lesson I carried with me, one of patience, of longing, and of a quiet love that grew not in the grand declarations, but in the gentle, unspoken touches that would stay with me always. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more age gap romance stories filled with slow burn tension and tender moments. Share your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear how the ending made you feel. And if you want more, check the playlist in the description for stories you won't want to miss.